I'm Kristen, this is Sarah, and we're LARPers. Like many of you, we play a really silly game with foam swords, one with 75,000 members and 1,030 separate and distinct chapters over 35 years of living lore and history. A game we both grew up in and we care very deeply about. Between just the two of us, we spent over 30 years playing this particular one, which is kind of intense.
We are actually specifically Amtgarders. Amtgard is an international fantasy combat LARP with an active and expanding membership. We have groups in nearly every single state.
Except Vermont. And Rhode Island, but it's not really a state.
We have groups internationally in Japan, England, Canada, and Croatia.
Amtgard started in a little park in El Paso called Memorial in the early 80s, and you guys remember how that was? Some of you. As with many other games, one weird guy had an idea to convince a bunch of others to come with him for the ride. From those very shaky beginnings and a photocopied handbook, we spread like kudzu all over the US and beyond.
Our game is a bit different than most of the LARPs here. We are organized on a large scale with 290 chapters meeting every week to dress up in funny costumes and participate in foam-based combat. Sometimes they even play a character. For the most part, though, the character is the least important aspect, with the focus instead being on fighting, completing objectives in games, crafting, and managing the group. Many of our traditions and our award structure are inspired by our older brother, the SCA. Roleplay in Amtgard will usually just take the form of generic characters acting as a hero or a monster, rarely being more in-depth than a particular class. So basically the opposite of that last talk.
Our chapters are organized into 17 kingdoms, which are based on geographic areas, and have elected monarchies. These groups meet regularly in multi-chapter gatherings of up to 1,000 people. At these events, again, the focus is mostly just spending time camping and fighting with friends, rather than playing a character. These people, approximately 5,000 of them every week. You put all those people in a room, miscommunications and conflicts are inevitable.
We have been experiencing a lot of growing pains in the last 5 years. From a formerly patchwork system, we have standardized our awards and recognition system. We have changed our codified body of law and rewritten our rulebook entirely. That much change can be hard on any group, let alone one as big and spread out as ours. And while turning the world upside down, we have also made 4 brand new kingdoms and several principalities.
These changes challenge some very deeply held power structures within our game. We had a lot of old guard who were crying foul. They thought we were chopping the living limbs off the tree, while the new guys thought it was all dead wood. They were like, "You're killing the game, the apocalypse is now." You know how they do. And the new guys were like, "No, this is great, this is actually how we do things. This makes more sense." By bringing the rules into how things were actually done, we were allowing for more flexibility for the player. At least that's what we hoped.
So how do you solve these arguments? How do you get the guy afraid of change to understand the guy who's excited by it? Each side is intractable in their belief and full of anecdotal evidence. There's really only one solution. You need data. The down-in-the-dirt real data, attendance trends, event tallies, chapter life cycles. How many people did we lose this year? How many did we gain in spite of all the upheaval?
Fortunately, our game being as old as it is, we have a long history of historians, even statisticians. From the very beginning, there were people writing all this stuff down. Who attended where? How many people were at a particular event? Where did they go? Where did I lose my place in the paragraph? I'm sorry. Then in the 90s, some really good stuff rolled in. With the advent of the internet and how it spread out, there was this guy, his name is Ruth, and he invented a local attendance tracker for his group. And then it spread outward, not just for his group, for every group. And because of that guy, we have 20 years of continuous attendance records. We're also fortunate to have a very actively edited wiki with several active forums, and because of the marvelous interconnectedness of the internet, we have relatively easy access to local contacts for groups, which is exactly what you need if you're going to talk to people on the ground with how the game is actually being affected by all the changes that you're enacting.
Since 2007, we have been conducting an annual audit of every single group under our umbrella, all 1,030 of them that have existed. It started kind of small with a, hey, you guys still playing? But now we ask a lot of questions. What days are you playing on? When do you start? What made you start? How do you advertise? What types of games do you play? Is your park near a major walkway? We also do these same interviews with parks that have gone defunct, asking why they've gone defunct, what would they have done differently.
Yeah, right, that's my turn. A lot of questions look at demographic data, since they can allow us to tap into studies in the world at large, not just in Larp. Even simple things like knowing the average age of a player allows you to know more about the types of references they're going to get if you put them in your rulebook. They also will help you understand what other systems of gaming and mechanics they're going to be familiar with. We also use these questions to update some of our historical records more easily, kind of en masse, instead of doing it piecemeal. Survey time may be a perfect time for a group to collect other types of information from its chapters, so we encourage local groups to do their own surveys and get feedback from their members.
All of this data, when taken together, paints a picture of what works and what doesn't. A real picture, not an anecdotal one. And because we are lucky enough to have these data points from before many of the changes happened, we can actually say factually that our game has grown. Even with the introduction of a drastically new rulebook, we still get, on average, the same number of new parks each year as before, about 45. Growth was, and still is, very steady.
We were able to conclusively prove that the game is growing. And gradually, those guys that were telling us that the game is dying, everything is going, the dream is gone, they're dying out too. They don't have a leg to stand on. It's impossible for people to spout their beliefs when they don't have any data, to be factual. When you can answer people back with actual numbers, they can't wave their beliefs in your face and hope it sticks.
We were also able to use this data to start some very important conversations, not just about the rulebook, but about all sorts of topics. Why are there so few women in most chapters, particularly larger chapters? With this data, rather than anecdotes, we are able to start conversations about the treatment of women on the field. Conversations that have the force of numbers behind the stories and are much harder for people to ignore. Slowly, the attitudes are changing and the game is becoming more welcoming for all genders.
We were able to use information about communities to learn that while groups are physically located more often at colleges than military bases, while there are more groups physically located at colleges than military bases, there are far more groups at military bases than you'd expect. I don't know what they're doing over there. There's a bunch of them. This has led to the formation of support groups for active duty military veterans in our group. That has spread further in our game. Now we're too close to it and that change to know what that's going to do for our game in the future, because we just don't have the data yet, but we will when it happens.
We can also look at outliers, parks with exceptionally high attendance or positive ties with other games, and ask them more about how they have achieved it. In 2015, we looked in-depth at recruitment methods, trying to identify which ones actually work. Unfortunately, no particular method produced statistically significant results, as happens. But hopefully, tracking it over a couple more years, we'll be able to tell. Anecdotally, word of mouth is the most effective, but
we don't really know. Now, this research is something anybody can do, and you guys know that. You don't have to be an organizer, though it certainly helps to have some kind of oomph behind your asking for added legitimacy. We started by tapping into existing resources that were already there, gathering up information, making lists of groups along with our questions, because before we started this, nobody had any idea how far Amtgard had spread. Nobody had any idea where people were playing. It turned out there was a whole principality in Croatia that nobody remembered.
Every group has one person who, whether they're in office or not, knows everything that's going on. We track that person down and ask them to fill out a survey. With times, our groups have gotten used to the yearly ritual and we're able to delegate some of the works onto local volunteers, so it's not a big job. Delegation is important. We use a Google survey, but there are plenty of other options.
I'm gonna go off script and interject. In the beginning, when we started this, we planned for 6 months of our year to be taken up with just getting surveys out and getting them back and following up. Like, we would start in January and hope we would have results by July.
I've gotten it down to probably 3 months.
She's much better at this than me.
I delegate more.
While there are a number of valid statistical sampling methods that are rarely used in Larps and are always questioned, so by collecting data at the group level, you avoid all the biases that you get from people who automatically and voluntarily will fill out your survey. Because those guys are nice, but they are not the full picture of your game.
Forming the questions is by far the more difficult than it would appear. My first year, all of the questions asked for paragraph answers. That was a terrible idea. Not only did this get a lot of very short paragraphs, I then had to go through and code it so that I could compare it to what other groups wrote. These days I use mostly multiple choice questions with a few areas for longer responses. It speeds up my report writing significantly and is a lot easier to get people to complete.
Like I said, she's much better at this than me. It's also important to keep your wording neutral. You don't want to ask leading questions, you get led answers. Bias survey will only produce biased results, and you'll lose the trust of your members because you are supposed to be the guy that's giving them the truth. And if you have leading questions intentionally or not, it's going to mess it right up. Avoid questions that can have multiple meanings. Questions that can be answered by numbers are always the best, but rating scales also work great. You should also avoid words that trigger controversy. If you're conducting a survey where there's a controversial issue in your group, find a sideways way to ask it. And rather than staring at the same argument that those guys have been having on Facebook all week. Because who wants to do that?
Running statistical tests is not nearly as difficult or scary as most people remember from high school. I've linked to a nice guide in the PowerPoint that I'm assuming will be online somewhere. But for the most part, you can simply compare things with almost no math involved. Often simply taking the mean, median, and mode, that is the 3 ways to average something, can be incredibly helpful. It also helps to farm out the statistics to a friend if you have someone who's interested in them.
Everybody's got that guy, right? All right, now Sarah wrote this paragraph and it has things in it that I don't know how to say. Most useful tests can be the
chi-squared.
Thank you. It tells you if your results are actually likely due to an actual difference or simple random chance. It's very important in telling if something is worth being seen as a fact or if it's another anecdote. Other tests, such as the t-test or the ANOVA, will allow you to measure the difference between groups, which can be perfect for deciding, say, which recruitment methods actually work.
The most important part is getting that information out there after you are done so you can use it. We present ours to our circle of monarchs as well as posting it literally everywhere we can think of on the internet. Your game likely has some other governing body that can use this information. You might also ask that body if there are particular questions that they need answers. When you work with the community to decide on the questions, they are more interested in providing answers and helping with the full completion of the survey.
You want them to buy in. Buy in hard. One of the most valuable results of the survey is that everybody gets a call. Everybody gets an email. Every group in the whole of our game is contacted. And those groups are pretty far-flung. Sometimes it's like the only LARPing group in a tiny town in Montana. And having that connection with the larger game makes them feel connected to us as a whole. And it also provides them with resources they wouldn't normally have, stuff that might be invented since the last time they were contacted. Reporting methods, or resources, or more wiki stuff. Sometimes groups only get contacted once a year for the State of Amtgard. Rules questions can be answered at that time, and they might be given links to other resources, which I already said because I got off book. Even groups that have a really big connection to the larger game will get a more varied perspective, because everybody in their own little pond gets this idea that that's the way it is everywhere else, and it's not. Everybody might have something somewhere else to teach you. The guys in the next state over are going to have different games that you don't know. They're gonna have different practices, maybe better practices, something you can learn from. And because we do this and we spread this information out, that stuff gets disseminated a lot faster than it might if somebody was just traveling from park to park.
Every group has some questions that they would like to answer more definitively. Every group has some degree of change over time. The sooner you start keeping track of these changes and begin leading with facts rather than feelings, the more your group will be able to flourish. Even the smallest group benefits from objective perspectives.
And we encourage all of you to dig deep into your data. It has wondrous things hiding in it, and they're for a myriad of good, but use its power for good.